Good morning, everyone on Eastern Standard Time. Welcome. My name is Melinda McClymans. I'm the Assistant Director of the Middle East Studies Center at Ohio State, and I'm your host for today's podcast, Keys to Understanding the Middle East. And I'm going to introduce our guest for today, John B. Quigley. He's the President's Club Professor Emeritus of Law at Ohio State University's Moritz College of Law. Before joining the Ohio State faculty in 1969, Professor Quigley was a research scholar at Moscow State University and a research associate in comparative law at Harvard Law School. Professor Quigley teaches international law and comparative law. In 1982 and 83, he was a visiting professor at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Professor Quigley is active in international human rights work. His numerous publications include books and articles on human rights, the United Nations, war and peace, East European law, African law, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. In 1995, he was recipient of the Ohio State University Distinguished Scholar Award. He formerly held the title of President's Club Professor of Law. And you can find him online giving interviews to the media, serving as an expert at the UN. His analyses can be found in magazines such as the Quincy Institute's Responsible Statecraft and many others, commenting on current events that are taking place around the world and internationally. So without any further ado, I am going to begin the interview with just a very simple question, which is, what is international law?
Well, international law is a set of norms that have been accepted by the international community as appropriate for the governance of the world. It's a very curious kind of law in that there is no central enforcement authority the way you would have in an individual country. I mean, in an individual country, you have police and a legislative body and courts, and there is implementation that makes the law such that people really have to follow it. In the international community, it's a bit more casual, one might say. There are enforcement mechanisms, but they are typically such that states can find ways to evade them. But at the same time, it's a body of law that is accepted as representing what states should do. And when states violate that body of law, they typically will get some negative reaction as a result that does put pressure on them to conform. They don't always conform, to be sure, but they do pay something of a price when they act inconsistently.
So when they pay a price, do you think it has more to do with kind of their reputation and their relationships with other states, or are there criminal implications? Like, aren't there some international criminal courts?
Yes, yeah. So it may be in terms of reputation, as you say, or it may be more specific. I mean, if you look at the war going on in Ukraine now, there are repercussions for Russia as a result, and there is an international system of criminal prosecution that is quite new, but is gaining more significance, so that individual governmental officials may find themselves being investigated for war crimes, and that is likely to increase in coming decades, because there is a greater capacity now to identify what goes on in a military situation. I mean, in the olden days, if you go back to the middle of the 20th century, you might have had a few reporters in foxholes telling the world what's going on. But now you have people with cell phones taking pictures of everything.
Wow. Yeah, that must have really changed the dynamic, just having the evidence of crimes. Yeah. So it seems like a really evolving kind of a field.
It really is. I mean, you see the phenomenon that we're talking about in Syria with a lot of collection of information for potential criminal prosecution. And certainly in Ukraine, it's happening right now.
Well, that's good to know. And of course, the reason why I asked that question is because our focus today is on Jerusalem, and it connects to several of the books you've written about Israel and Palestine, their history, and especially around the formation of Israel and the UN's role. And Jerusalem has a really unique status and just kind of circumstance within that history. And of course, a much older history, but I wanted to focus today more on kind of modern or current events, and especially starting from 1953, actually. And I learned this from one of your recent publications, that in 1953, Israel, the newly formed state of Israel, moved their foreign ministry to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. So that was kind of a very meaningful move, and had, I assume, some kind of purpose behind it. Do you think you could talk a little bit about that and what the implications are for today as well?
Yes, yeah, 1953 was a significant year, you might say, for the status of Jerusalem, because the government of the newly formed state of Israel decided to move its foreign ministry to Jerusalem. Previously, the entire administrative structure of Israel had been in Tel Aviv, which was the major kind of city of Jewish population at that point. That's where the statehood of Israel was declared in 1948, and the view of the international community at the time, and this is, I suppose, where international law comes in, the view was that it was not appropriate for Jerusalem to be controlled by either the Arabs or the Jews, given its significance for both, and that some kind of accommodation needed to be made for Jerusalem. And the idea was that it would be administered separately from either the Jewish area or the Arab area for a period of 10 years, and that the UN would try to work out some kind of solution during that time period. So that was the idea that was put forward at the United Nations in 1947. then you did have both sides focusing on Jerusalem for reasons that are not entirely clear, but relate to the fact that it was the seat of several of the major religions of the world. And there were governments that, in a way, sponsored the religions. During the 1920s, there was great argumentation over who should control the old city of Jerusalem, sometimes called the walled city because of the wall around it, where you have sites that are considered important in Judaism, in Roman Catholicism, in Protestantism, and these had been controlled more or less by the French and Italians up until that point in time. That is when Jerusalem was under the Turkish Empire. And then you had Britain coming in and taking control of the entire country of Palestine, including Jerusalem. And that was seen as something of a threat by the French and Italians. So they contended over it. But to bring it up to 1947, the idea was that there should be some international administration for a period of time. And then you had the state of Israel being declared, or that stated was declared for a Jewish state with the name Israel, and the government was based in Tel Aviv, but at the same time, it was not accepting the idea that Jerusalem should be controlled internationally, and was making that opposition rather clear. And this came into sharp focus when Israel applied for membership in the United Nations in the spring of 1949. And when that process was going on at the United Nations, specifically in the General Assembly, and I suppose this is another way international law has a role here, because you have an international institution that admits new states to membership, and that membership is quite significant. And when the issue of Israel's membership came up, it was handled in a way quite differently from what you typically find with states that apply for membership. Typically, a state, let's say at the period when colonialism was ending and you had new states in Africa and elsewhere, they would submit an application. They would say, we agree that we'll abide by the rules of the United Nations, and that would be about the extent of the inquiry. That is, they wouldn't be examined too much. But with Israel, it was quite different for two major reasons. One was that the military forces that had established Israel had forced most of the population out of the country. And that was considered to be inappropriate and a violation of international law by the states of the world. The other issue was Jerusalem, specifically that the government of Israel was making it sound as if it wanted to take over Jerusalem in contravention of the idea of an international administration. So there's a whole series of hearings that were held in a committee of the General Assembly. These are all available digitally, for students that want to go into this.
Yeah.
All you have to do is go on the UN website or ask a reference librarian how to access. And it's very interesting. You'll find the representative of Israel being questioned on these two issues, whether Israel planned to repatriate these people that had been forced out of the country, because this was quite a remarkable, negatively remarkable situation, that you had a population of a country whose majority had been forced out, and they were in refugee camps nearby in very bad situations. So the representatives, I'm thinking, specifically Belgium was quite strong in raising these issues, but others as well. Asking the representative of Israel, well, are you going to repatriate these people? And the response was a bit on the cagey side, and the question on Jerusalem as well. Although on the question of Jerusalem, the representative of Israel, a man by the name of Abba Eban, E-B-A-N, was the foreign minister. He acknowledged that Jerusalem and its status raised an international issue, that this was not something that Israel had complete control over, that is, it could decide on its own what the status of Jerusalem would be. He acknowledged that it was an international matter, and he gave that answer. And this answer,
just to recap a little bit. So, since you're talking about the foreign minister, he'd be the same one who then in 1953 moved to Jerusalem with the foreign ministry, or was it someone different?
The same fellow, yes.
Okay. So that's interesting. So they declared, I just want to review really quickly. They declared themselves the state of Israel in 1948. And then they went to the UN in 1949 to be admitted as a member state, correct? And that's where these hearings are going on.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay. Just to get get the full context. So then he's acknowledging that Jerusalem is a unique case at that point. Like before they moved the ministry, he's saying, yeah, it's Jerusalem is sort of sovereign, like it sort of rules itself, and at the same time, it's a part of the international community. Can you maybe correct me on that or elucidate that a little bit?
Well, it was considered to be part of Palestine, but it was unclear exactly how Palestine was going to be governed at that point. The UN actually was trying to establish a trusteeship over the entirety of Palestine, which didn't go anywhere, that idea. But then in these hearings, the foreign minister was pressed on the question of Jerusalem and gave an assurance that was quite important for the decision to admit Israel as a member state, because it was quite clear that these questions were being asked to see whether Israel should be admitted. One of the requirements of UN membership is that you have to be peace-loving. An interesting concept.
I didn't know that, but it makes sense because it goes back to the League of Nations and the idea of preventing war, right? I mean, that's the kind of purpose of the UN, I suppose.
Precisely, yeah. So it's stated as a condition of membership. This is Article 4 of the UN Charter, that membership is open to peace-loving states. So Israel was being challenged as to whether it was peace-loving, given that it was refusing to readmit the people that it had forced out of the country, and that it was not accepting what was considered appropriate for Jerusalem. I think the idea at the UN was that if either side had complete control of Jerusalem, that wouldn't work, and therefore they came up with this idea of international administration. So in any event, the vote went in favor of Israel. This is in May of 1949. For membership. Within several months, the leader of the government of Israel, they had a provisional government, it was called at the time, and the prime minister was a man named David Ben-Gurion. He made a statement, a public statement, saying, well, Jerusalem belongs to us. It's really ours. And over the next few months, they began to move different offices to Jerusalem as a way of concretizing their claim, and this went on over the next couple of years. And then in 1953, as you were mentioning earlier, the foreign ministry was moved into Jerusalem. I mean, there had been in the interim, though, as I say, other things. The legislative body that was under the new state was convened in Jerusalem. And the court, the highest court that was set up for the state, was also convened there. So the moving of the foreign ministry wasn't the only step in that direction, but it was seen as particularly important because outside governments in any state communicate with the foreign ministry, and this meant that states like Britain, the United States, France, if they wanted to have discussions with the foreign ministry of Israel, would have to come to Jerusalem for that purpose rather than to Tel Aviv. So having the foreign ministry move there raised an international issue in the way that having the court or the legislature did not. And this evoked a tremendous negative reaction from the states of the world, in particular the major powers. You can go back and look in documentation of the U.S. Department of State, for example. The Department of State has, at the time, something called a bulletin that it put out with press releases, and the United States came out negatively on this, saying that it would not communicate in Jerusalem with the foreign ministry, that it would maintain communications from Tel Aviv. And typically states will have their own embassies in the same city as a foreign ministry for purposes of communication. And the United States indicated that it was not going to move its embassy out of Tel Aviv. And other states took the same position on that. And that has actually held until the present time, most states of the world that have diplomatic relations with Israel, and not all states do have diplomatic relations with Israel, but those that do typically maintain their embassies in Tel Aviv. Yeah, so that's why this 1953 move was so important, because in a way it reinforced the view of the international community about Jerusalem, that it needed to be under some kind of at least temporary international administration, and that it not be taken over entirely by Israel.
What do you think of that plan to do international administration of Jerusalem, or really the idea for any territory to be administered internationally?
Well, it's not an ideal outcome, and it was not viewed as a permanent plan. It was to be in effect for a period of 10 years only. And according to the plan, there was to be a referendum held in the city towards the end of that 10-year period to decide on some, status for the city. Now, whether that was a realistic plan or not, it's hard to say. There is no good, hard and fast way to resolve issues of that sort.
Okay, so, but the intention was to actually have the people of Jerusalem decide, that means.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
And what about the former colonial, leaders or people sort of in control of the area? Would they have a say in that as well, or?
Well, it had been controlled by Britain, and Britain had pulled itself out by, let's say, the end of, let's say during the middle of 1948. So Britain was not in control any longer.
Okay. So probably they were then kind of on board with this idea of, let's let the locals decide their own governance structure or power structure.
Yes, Britain was distancing itself from the status issue at that point. Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, that's interesting too, because Jerusalem, I mean, it's such a diverse place. It's because it's, especially in terms of the different religions. I mean, the quarters are famous. Like there's the Armenian quarter and the Jewish quarter that you hear about, in the news when they're talking about Jerusalem. So I guess they were thinking it'd be some kind of majority rule then, like take a vote and then.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to imagine exactly how that would have worked. For one reason, a large part of the Arab population had been forced out by the Jewish military. So whereas in 1947, you had relative parity of population, by the end of 1948, it was a very strongly majority Jewish population. How you would have constructed a referendum, whether the people who were forced out would be allowed to vote, that was all left unclear.
Wow. Okay. Thanks so much for shedding some light on the details of that, because those each year seems pivotal at that time period, in terms of kind of the starting point for where we're at today. And Jerusalem was again in the news in 2018. regarding, I think the U.S. either tried to move our embassy to Jerusalem or did move it. Could you talk a little bit about what's going on there today?
Yes. The history gets curiouser and curiouser, you might say. The next major event was that Israel took control of the entirety of the city in 1967.
Okay.
The 1948 situation was resolved by Jordan occupying the eastern sector, including the old city, the one you're talking about with the Armenian quarter, the Jewish quarter, and with Israel occupying the what's generally referred to as the western sector of the city. And that's the way things stood up until 1967, when you had a war during which the Israeli forces managed to occupy the entire sector of Palestine that had been under the control of Jordan, and that included the eastern sector of Jerusalem. So in 1967, you have a major change in the situation, with Israel taking over the entirety of the city. And that kind of, I suppose, brings you up to the point in time that you're asking about, 2018. And as I was saying, up until the present time, most countries have not wanted to acknowledge that Israel has sovereignty over any part of Jerusalem. So that's why they maintain their diplomatic establishments in Tel Aviv. And when Israel took control in 1967 of the eastern sector, that was objected to by the international community as a measure that Israel was taking to try to establish its permanent control, meaning sovereignty over the entirety of the city. And this played out at the UN in the summer of 1967, because immediately after taking control of the eastern sector, the government of Israel announced that it would apply the law and administration of Israel to the eastern sector of the city. It did not do something similar for the entirety of the Palestine territory it had taken from Jordan in that 1967 war, but it did so with regard to the eastern sector of Jerusalem, and it adopted regulations and law in which it defined the territory of Jerusalem, and defined it very expansively, actually, to include a good part of the territory outside the walled city. And Israel was quizzed about this at the United Nations, because when you take territory militarily, that doesn't give you title to it. The territory is considered to be under what's called belligerent occupation. And the law on belligerent occupation, here's where international law comes in again. The law on belligerent occupation is that you're not supposed to change the law. You're supposed to administer it under the existing regulations, pending some kind of peace agreement that would resolve status. But Israel was going ahead and immediately saying, our law will apply in the eastern sector of Jerusalem. The General Assembly of the United Nations, the Security Council of the United Nations adopted resolutions condemning that, but did not take any forceful action. That is, the Security Council, which is supposed to deal with war and peace, could, in principle, have stepped in and sent a military force there to counter what Israel was doing.
So they could have intervened, but they didn't at that point?
They could have, yeah. They were being supported, that is, the government of Israel was being supported by the United States, which is a member of the Security Council. Security Council operates on the basis of a veto for the major powers. So it was quite clear that the Security Council would not take action of that kind because of the opposition of the United States. The other states in the Security Council were prepared to condemn Israel for aggression, for taking that territory, but the United States was kind of fending off those efforts in the Security Council. But that left a situation in which Israel was in control of the entirety of the city. And it began to administer it. It connected the municipal services like electricity and water to the western sector, which was a way of trying to solidify control over the city. But at the same time, it was not so interested in maintaining the population of the city, which was overwhelmingly Arab. And it established an administrative regime under which it deemed the residents of the eastern sector to be what it called residents, meaning that they had status that was not the kind of status that people normally have in their own countries.
Interesting. So the people in the eastern part of Jerusalem, they were, I guess, acknowledged, but not given citizenship or rights or anything like that.
That's right. They were offered the chance to participate in elections, which the people rejected because they didn't accept Israeli control. But the problem with this residency, was several. One, that Israel controlled who could come in. So if, for example, one person is as a resident of Jerusalem and wants to marry somebody from the other sector of Palestine that was taken by Israel during that 1967 war, that was controlled by the immigration authorities of Israel, and typically they would not allow new people to move in. So that was one way of controlling the population of Jerusalem. The other was that if a person went out of Jerusalem for a significant period of time, as many did, because once Israel took it over, the economic situation was not good, and many people had jobs that they got abroad elsewhere in the Middle East or in Europe. If they did that and moved out for a significant period of time, they would lose their status. That is, they couldn't come back once their job abroad ended. And the Israeli government developed this notion that they called the person's center of life, So if the person from Jerusalem moved to some other country for a period and wanted to move back, that would be controlled. And if the authorities said, well, your center of life is now in Kuwait, it's not here, you can't move back. So that was very problematic. The other thing is that the government of Israel began allowing its own people to move into the eastern sector, and the government would take over land, would expropriate land for those people, and that was heavily criticized by the international community. That action of moving one's people into territory under belligerent occupation is considered a war crime. And the International Criminal Court presently has before it a petition to investigate with the idea of prosecuting current Israeli officials for facilitating the transfer of their own citizens into settlements in this territory under belligerent occupation, whether in Jerusalem or in other parts of Palestine that Israel occupied in 1967. So that's again how international law can impact these situations.
That is okay. That's very helpful.
But I think I haven't gotten up to answering your question about 2018.
It's a lot. I mean, so much happened between then and now. I'm processing it all. But yes, please do. Where are we at now in terms of Jerusalem status and administration and how it's recognized internationally?
I mean, there was in 1993 an agreement between the governments of Palestine and Israel that they would make peace. Mm-hmm. And one aspect of that was that they would resolve the status of Jerusalem. That is a process that has not been successful, but that was the next step, you might say, in terms of the status of Jerusalem. But it was consistent with the UN idea that the status needed to be worked out in some way. Not exactly. This wouldn't be the way that the 1947 resolution contemplated. But by that point in time, you had a government of Palestine that was able to function on behalf of the Arab population, and that had displaced the Jordanian government in that role, even though the territory was controlled by Israel. But one of the things they were supposed to resolve was the status of Jerusalem. And there was negotiation that was held beginning in 1999, and that culminated in a meeting in the United States under the auspices of the United States, and specifically President Bill Clinton. It was held at Camp David, Maryland, the presidential retreat outside of Washington, in July of 2000. And the same issues that had come before the UN in 1949, the repatriation of the people that were forced out, the status of Jerusalem, nothing had been resolved in that intervening time period.
50 years later. I mean, yeah, over 50 years.
Exactly. And at the time, I had been asked actually by the British government to consult with the government of Palestine during those negotiations. and had done so starting in the latter part of 1999 and through the spring of 2000 when they were preparing for this meeting in Camp David. And it was very unclear how that would all work out. President Clinton put pressure on the Palestine government not to press too strongly on the issue of the repatriation of the Arabs of the country, and he also put pressure on them not to press too strongly on the issue of Jerusalem. But it was really unclear for, I would say, going back now, thinking about May, June of the year 2000, it was not clear to me, actually, and to others who were consulting on the Palestine side, how this would all play out, and whether the government of Palestine would agree to a peace agreement that would leave Israel in control of Jerusalem and would not require the repatriation of the residents who had been forced out in 1948.
So I'm curious, what kinds of questions were the Palestinian negotiators asking you, like when you were in this consultation process?
I was focusing primarily on the issue of the refugees, the residents who had been forced out in 1948, and establishing that they did, in fact, have a right under international law to be repatriated, so that the government of Palestine, when entering into these negotiations with Israel, would be able to have a strong position that it could base in law, saying you have an obligation, you, the government of Israel, have an obligation to repatriate these people, because that was something accepted in international law. You now have it actually in the International Criminal Court statute that says that it can be considered a crime against humanity if you violate human rights in a major way, affecting a large number of people. So in any event, that was some of the focus in the run-up to those negotiations.
So 1993, it's the famous peace agreement between Yasser Arafat, I think, and was it Rabin?
Yitzhak Rabin, yes.
I remember the pictures of them shaking hands, like with Clinton there, pulling their hands together to shake hands. Wow. And then, but it took them like 6 more years to actually discuss Jerusalem and what to do about it.
Exactly. I mean, those peace negotiations under the 1993 agreement, those were supposed to happen within a couple of years. But then you had a change of government in Israel. Mr. Netanyahu came in. And he was opposed to the idea of peace negotiations, and so they didn't happen. Then eventually, the government of Israel changed again, and a man named Ehud Barak came back as the prime minister. That is, I say, coming back in the sense of coming back to having a government that was at least willing to talk in the spirit of the 1993 agreement. And so he was the prime minister who led the Israeli team at Camp David with Yasser Arafat as the leader of the Palestine team.
Okay, wow. That I remember those years, but I had forgotten that Netanyahu didn't want to discuss the peace agreement. So that's important history.
Right. But this issue, I mean, nothing got resolved at Camp David, largely because of the same two issues, the repatriation issue and the Jerusalem issue, on which Mr. Arafat was not prepared to concede to the Israeli position. President Clinton kind of took the Israeli side. He was not very helpful in the matter, in my estimation. But people have different reads on those negotiations. Books have been written. You can read books written by both the Palestinian and the Israeli negotiators, and they all have their read on exactly how it played out and why it didn't succeed. But I think it's fair to say that the issue of Jerusalem was a key to preventing the overall agreement between Israel and Palestine that would have led to a Palestine state alongside an Israel state.
Okay. Wow, it's really pivotal. I mean, I always hear that, and now I understand why now a lot better.
But I still haven't gotten up to 2018.
Do you want to try to get there before we move on to?
Okay, quickly, what happened is that you had a new president coming in the United States, who was prepared to take Israel's side even more strongly than prior U.S. administrations, and for a variety of reasons that may relate more to his political stance and getting the evangelical vote in the United States. But for whatever reason, he said that he would accept Israel's sovereignty over the entirety of the city. In 1980, the Israeli legislative body, I should have mentioned this before. In 1980, the Israeli legislative body adopted a statute saying this territory of Jerusalem that we took in 1967 is Israeli territory. It's no longer under belligerent occupation. It is our territory, and it is the capital of Israel. That action was condemned by the Security Council, including by the United States. At the time, Jimmy Carter was president, as a violation of the law of belligerent occupation. But in any event, from 1980, that was the position of the Israeli government. So President Trump then in 2017 said, we accept that, even though no other government of the world had done so. And then he said, we're going to move our embassy into the city of Jerusalem as an indication of our acceptance of the idea that the city is under the sovereignty of Jerusalem. So that occurred then in the spring of 2018, which I remember quite well because I happened to be in Istanbul at the time that all happened. And the television stations in Istanbul were after me to give interviews on Turkish TV about what was going on, because this was very strongly opposed on the Arab side. There were demonstrations, particularly in the Gaza sector of Palestine, against this. leading to confrontations on the frontier between Gaza and Israel, and people, were being shot on the Arab side by Israeli military. So it was a very bad situation. And the TV stations in Istanbul were after me to get an American perspective on what was going on. But in any event, that's what occurred. When Mr. Biden came in, he did not reverse that. So he has said that he will keep the embassy there, even though other governments have continued to maintain their embassies in Tel Aviv.
Okay, good to know. So that brings us up to the present day, and we have a few more minutes left. So I just want to ask you if there's what you're working on now, if there's anything you want to share, maybe what students should have on their radar if they want to take a class or, learn more about your work.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we do have quite a bit going on at the university through the Middle East Center and otherwise. In the College of Law, where I'm based, there's a student group called the Middle East Law Association that focuses on these issues, along with others relating to the Middle East, to just spread knowledge about the situation. And I have been working on some writings, research dealing with the issue of Palestine, going back specifically to the period of the 1920s and Britain's control of the territory and how that all played out from a legal perspective. I'm just publishing a book that will be out probably in 2 months, called Britain and Its Mandate Over Palestine. Then the subtitle is important. The subtitle is Legal Chicanery on a World Stage. So the point of the book is that Britain tried to make it sound as if what it was doing was legal in bringing in an outside population of people, namely a Jewish population from Europe. Britain tried to make it sound as if all of that was legal, and my book goes through the documentation of that period to show that it was not done legally. That's why the subtitle is Legal Chicanery.
And at that time, they did have sovereignty over Palestine, correct?
Well, they didn't. That's the point of my book.
Okay. Sorry, because I just remember they were issuing white papers and, were kind of in control there, I think. But maybe just they took over without following the law.
Right. They were trying to get sovereignty. The only way they could get it was by a peace treaty with Turkey. And they wrote up a peace treaty in which Turkey would have ceded sovereignty. Turkey ultimately refused to ratify that treaty. And a different peace treaty was signed with Turkey that did not give Britain any status. And that left Britain kind of holding the bag, being there without any sovereignty. So that's something I go through in this book in some detail.
Oh, that sounds very transformative in terms of our perceptions of that history.
It is, because at the UN they misunderstood the history when it came to 1947. The Jewish Agency, which was the kind of the representative of the Zionist movement, the movement for a Jewish statehood, managed to ghostwrite a memorandum that was produced at the United Nations And according to this memorandum, the international community had more or less guaranteed the rights of world Jewry to have a state in Palestine. And what my book shows is that really never happened.
Okay, wow. Well, definitely looking forward to that publication. Let me know when it comes out. I'll, shout out to everyone and share it on social media so people can buy the book. Anything else you want to share before we end the broadcast?
Good. No, I think, we've managed to cover this. I apologize for taking a long time to get to answering your questions. But it's the history of Jerusalem, even just this period that we've talked about is so full of events that I think it required a bit of the backstory.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It was really fascinating discussion with you today. I want to thank you again for joining us and taking some time out from your busy schedule. I know your topic keeps you very busy, so I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the work you do with our students. So thanks again. And I will, share this video on YouTube and push out this podcast so more people can enjoy this elucidating interview, and maybe share, some of the resources you brought up, like the UN hearings you can find online, and some other things. So I'll kind of curate some things people can follow up with to learn more. I at the beginning, I didn't mention all the books that, you have many books on this, on related topics to Israel, to Jerusalem. The Statehood of Palestine, International Law in the Middle East Conflict, Cambridge University Press, 2010. The Six-Day War and Israeli Self-Defense, Questioning the Legal Basis for Preventative War, 2013. International Diplomacy of Israel's Founders, Deception at the United Nations in the Quest for Palestine, Cambridge University Press, 2016. So just fascinating to get the legal perspective on all these issues. And I think it really does improve our understanding of gets beyond the stereotypes about the conflict, and really improves our understanding about, what's really difficult and how different states are kind of framing, the disagreements. So thanks again. And I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast. And thanks everyone who was watching. And I'll be in touch. Have a great day.